Going.
Blimey, that was abrupt. Right, so thank you everyone for coming along today, and welcome again. It's been a while since we did the last meetup. We've got a fantastic agenda tonight. We're going to be going through a couple of areas, and hopefully they're pretty consistent. So we've got Stephanie Gooch from Amazon AWS. Talking about an area which is often forgotten. It's optimizing those forgotten services, the ones that appear on the bill that a lot of people don't consider, don't look at, but still cost you an awful lot of money if you get them wrong. And then following Steph, we've got Mike Bradbury, who is going to be covering the process of getting engineers excited and keeping them excited during the process of FinOps. So how do you keep them engaged, get them engaged, and stop politics getting in the way? And then after that, we're going to move into simple Q&A. And between each session, we'll obviously have the opportunity to ask questions. And I think the presenters generally are okay to ask questions during their presentation, but it might be easier to wait till the end of their sessions. So the team today, you've got me here from Positive, we've got Boots from Ukes Net-a-Porter, and Stephanie, as I said, from Amazon AWS, and we've got Mike from Juno CX. Just a few kind of brief points. So we are recording the session today, and so it would help if you can stay on mute wherever you can during each presentation. We definitely love questions, as many as possible. That really helps. And so you can ask your questions either via the chat window or by kind of unmuting yourselves. And once we finish the session, please let us know what you'd like to see covered in future events. We're always looking for potential speakers and also looking for any ideas of the kind of areas that you'd like to see. As a foundation question, a very important one. So Steve Trask from the foundation has asked quite an important question, which is, the foundation is always trying to create new material and content to help practitioners and to help you all. And the important question is, what would you actually like to see? What information would be beneficial? What kind of content? I don't expect you to answer it right now, but if you could just pop your thoughts into the chat window as we go through, and once we finish the session tonight, I'll collate it all together and share it with Steve. And very importantly, if you're not already a foundation member, please don't forget to go to finops.org, make sure you register, and as some of you just heard from JR's perspective, make sure you do the exams and get certified, because it does help. So with no further adu, I'll hand you over to Steph for the session on optimizing forgotten services.
Thank you. You need to allow me to share screen, apparently.
You should be able to.
Oh, no, whatever. It's coming. All right, let me know when you guys can see.
You're all good.
All right, I will jump into it. So welcome everyone to the FinOps meetup. It's nice to be back. I think I spoke at the first one we ever did. Feels like I don't know how many years ago. So it's nice to be back with you guys. And today I'm going to be talking about the others, and I don't mean the 2001 horror film. As Mark mentioned, I'm talking about the other services that we often see in things like Cost Explorer that we forget about when it comes to optimization and kind of saving money across AWS. So let's get into it. So a bit of background before we start. So my name is Stephanie Gooch. I'm a commercial architect at Amazon. I've been there for just over a year, but I've been working in the world of FinOps, cloud financial management, for about 4 years now. And I'm a commercial architect. So I look after telco customers across EMEA, and I focus on cost optimization, so saving money, cost-aware culture. So a lot of what the foundation brings in, that bringing together different people from different teams, so whether that's managers, finance, kind of key stakeholders that need to have one kind of collaborative conversation, sharing best practices. So I get to look across all of telco across EMEA, and I can see what's going on, what the trends are, and kind of share that with my customers. And financial processes, so things like chargeback, showback, all that kind of fun. And before I was at AWS, I was a DevOps engineer and head of FinOps at KPMG UK. So I'll probably mention them a few times with some of my stories for today. But enough about me. Let's take a look at this view. Now, hopefully this is a familiar view for those of you that are AWS customers. This is AWS Cost Explorer, and it helps customers to visualize, understand, and manage their AWS costs using either a daily or monthly kind of view. And likely we've all seen this before, and we've all likely seen these individual kind of sets of costs. So the kind of top spenders that we see, EC2 instances, S3, RDS, and kind of upfront commitments, so savings plans or RIs. And there are ways in which we often optimize. And these are the ways that as a commercial architect, we start with these kind of top spenders because they can often have the most impact. And we have this pattern of optimization. So we start from the top and we look at visualizing costs. So we look at Cost Explorer, like I just showed, utilizing the Kerr to create QuickSight dashboards or any kind of third-party tools to visualize your costs as well. When it comes to those 3 top spending areas, we look at things like elasticity, storage, tiers, and right sizing. So using things like Instance Scheduler to turn things off at night, using S3 Lens to look at your storage and see whether you can optimize, whether you can move things into a lower tier or kind of get rid of things you're not using.
Yeah,
And
gotcha.
right,
Yeah.
Oh, someone's not on mute. Sorry. And right sizing. So coming in, looking at how much you're utilizing of AWS services and scaling them up or down, depending on how much you need. And then we go into the more kind of technical areas, so data transfer, spot, and serverless. Now, these are all kind of common. We've probably all heard of them. We know how to save money on these things. But this isn't what this talk is about. This talk is about the other services. And these are the 2 that I've highlighted here. So EC2 Other and Others. The reason why these are key is you can look across this chart and you can see that EC2 Other is the same cost as things like RDS, and Others is often kind of one of the biggest areas of spend, which makes sense because it's a culmination of all the charges across your AWS account that aren't these other kind of top tier services. And the reason why this is really important to me when I think back to my journey in cloud financial management is when I remember back in a time, and some of you might remember this too, is there was a time when you would go on Cost Explorer and you would look at this view, you'd scroll down to see your kind of export in a CSV, and everything in Others would be summarized as one line. So you would have your split out of the other services, but Others was just one bulk cost. And this used to drive me nuts when I first kind of looked into FinOps. And this is where I got started with things like the cost and usage report and pushed that into QuickSight. And this was long before things like the cost intelligence dashboard or the Kudos framework existed. So I had to kind of figure out what was going on in these services. So I really care about the fact that now we can luckily see what those services are in Cost Explorer, but we often don't really think about them. So as there's a lot of spend in these others, there are ways to optimize. And so we're going to focus on, first of all, the others. So my top 5 services outside of the kind of top 3 that you see all the time and how we can save money for them. So kicking off, my first service is CloudWatch. And as Mark said, if anybody wants to ask questions, if you really want to ask them as I'm going, feel free. Otherwise, if you want to drop them in the chat and maybe say like for later, then we can kind of culminate them and I can answer at the end. So CloudWatch. So as a reminder, this is a monitoring service that helps developers see actionable insights into their applications. And I've seen it used across almost all accounts. It's relied on heavily by developers and applications to see what's going on under the hood. But one thing that you don't really see is people actually thinking about how to optimize them. They're such a useful service. I mean, I use them to help my customers, but we rarely hear about how CloudWatch costs are going to be involved when you think about how much you're going to spend in the cloud in total. So when you're budgeting for the cloud, you see those top 3 services being put into a calculator, but you don't really think about CloudWatch. And it's often forgotten about when you're thinking about optimizing, because again, you're focusing on those top services. But these services do have a price and there are ways to optimize them. And the first one we're going to look at is retention policies. So one of the ways in which CloudWatch costs are incurred, and one of the top ways, is ingestion and storage of logs in CloudWatch. And this is the same as concept as most of the things we see in the cloud. The big spending things are storage. And the default is often never expire, which you can see on this screenshot here. So log groups are stored to never expire, and it means that the data is being stored constantly and it's going to be there forever. You're going to be paying for it forever. But this kind of compound spend over time really does add up. And this is where we've seen a lot of customers kind of get concerned with their costs. So what I recommend is to be reviewed. So the first way to do this is look at your costs. So identifying where you're spending it, if it is CloudWatch logs. There is something called the well-architected labs, which I'm involved in a lot, and there's something called the Kerr library. In that, great query, which helps you identify your CloudWatch spend so you can really see what's going on. If it is CloudWatch, you then want to look at your policies. So like I showed you on the last screen, see what those retention policies are set to, and maybe think about, can I change these? And a way to decide that is check the frequency of your logs. If you have an application that only runs once a month, you might want to keep maybe 6 months a year of data because you've got it very infrequently. If your application's running once a day or multiple times a day, that's a lot of logs it's going to be spitting out sometimes. So you might want to reduce that policy down to a 6-month period. And obviously, not saying that you should go and change and delete all your retention policies right now within your accounts, but it is something to be reviewed and start to think about why you're using CloudWatch and if you need to store all that data. This process also works for CloudWatch metrics. So if you see CloudWatch metrics as being quite a high option, then you can look and see kind of if the metrics you have running are needed. We had a customer who was they'd enabled detailed monitoring for their metrics, and it turned out that they were not using it at all. They were only using the default ones, but their costs kept increasing. And just by switching this off, they actually save 50% of their CloudWatch logs. And those kind of things can make a big impact when you're working on savings. So the key is to understand why we are using CloudWatch and not to waste money with it, like a lot of things in the cloud. So for each of my 5 services we're going to go through, there's going to be one of these slides, which is kind of my key takeaway. So if you want to screenshot it, I think these are kind of useful concepts to summarize each point. So the problem we see is that people are storing unnecessary logs, or they have too many metrics for what they actually need. The key thing is to review and see why you are using the CloudWatch like settings, whether you use metrics, whether you use logs, and review and see if you actually need to use them. So recommend checking out that Kerr query. I mean, if anything, go and look today, go onto Well Architected Labs, run that Kerr query for CloudWatch and see what's actually going on and see if you could optimize in some ways. There's also a great blog by AWS, which is Reduce Future CloudWatch Charges. I would recommend that. That is a great resource, and it links very heavily to that query I mentioned. So if you have, it gives you examples if you had high cost in one of the services, how to reduce those costs. So moving on to another service, we have CloudTrail. So this is a way to log and continuously monitor your accounts and retain account activity across your entire infrastructure. And there are 2 great things about CloudTrail when it comes to kind of cost and management of them. The first is you can set up an organization trail. So this enables monitoring across your entire AWS organization and collects all the data you need for things like audits, governance, compliance. Great. The other great thing is the first trail you set up is free. Amazing. So you get this one trail, you set across all your accounts, you gather all your information, and it's free. Perfect. But wait, you might be thinking, well, why is Steph talking about this in a cost optimization session? Well, people don't just have one trail. They often have multiple. And in this example here, you can see there's 1, 2, 3 CloudWatch trails. So it means they are now paying for 2 of those trails. And they're also paying for 3 times the amount of storage for the data, because each CloudTrail has a storage bucket. So that's kind of tripling your cost. This doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have this across all of your accounts, again, it can really add up. And this is a lot of what these services are about, is when it adds up across the board. So when I was at KPMG, we had this problem where we had an organization trail that was set up by the security team, awesome, so that they could run and monitor what was going on all the accounts. But then in our Terraform audit modules that we deployed into every single account, there were 2 trails in there. One of them was used for monitoring, one was just there by default. And because that was always deployed in every account, no one even thought about it until we went in and looked and said, why are we spending this much money on CloudTrail? So we went in, and it was a large saving we were able to make just by getting rid of those CloudTrails when we didn't need the data. So key things for this: if you're spending any money on CloudTrail, I would go and have a look into it. There are sometimes valid reasons for this. So just a caveat that sometimes you have the security team manages the entire central organization of data, and an application team want to have their own one for their account. That makes sense. But do you need it for all of your accounts? Do you need it for all your dev and test accounts? Potentially not. So have a look at your multiple trails and conduct kind of an inventory and remove the duplicate trails, and also remove the buckets as well, or at least put your buckets into a lower tiered storage class, because you don't need them because they are just duplicates. A key thing I found when I was first doing this, we were a bit concerned about deleting loads of cloud trails, so we just stopped them first. So you can stop a trail and it won't cost you any money, so that might be an option. So check that out, and you can use something like the AWS CLI to list all of your cloud trails in an account. So moving away from kind of governance and into compute. AWS Lambda. So AWS Lambda is a serverless compute service. It's lightweight, and it means that you only pay for what you use. And that's one of the reasons we love the cloud, right? So we love the fact that this thing means that whenever you run it, you just pay for that time. There's no worry about things being left on all the time. It's naturally cost effective straight out of the box. And the way you pay for Lambda is it's actually the count of requests plus the memory size times the Lambda duration. And you can see this information in your CloudWatch logs, or when you initially run the Lambda, this will be in there. So you can see there that the memory size I provisioned for this was 2,688 megabytes, and it ran for 266 milliseconds. So this will be taken into consideration when I'm charged. But even though you only pay for what you use, there is still a risk of over provisioning with Lambda. And so it's possible to find this information, again, in the CloudWatch logs, but they are quite buried. But you can see here, I mentioned that I provisioned 2,688 megabytes for this Lambda function, but I only used 935. So there's a massive bit of compute and storage there that I'm not even using. And it's probably the fact that we have a default value put in, especially things like our Terraform modules or our CloudFormation templates. And I just kind of put that in and I was like, that sounds about right, but I didn't review it. So you can go individually into your Lambda functions and see these numbers and make a change, or there is a way to see it across the board. So AWS Compute Optimizer has Lambda in it, so you can go in and check it out and see if there are ways to optimize, and it will give you some information about how you can save money, which is great. It makes it a lot easier when it comes to those individual accounts. And I also want to shout out to the well-architected labs. Again, you will constantly hear me rant about these things because I love them and they are so useful and not enough people use them. And the optimization data collector lab has a module where it'll allow you to collect all your compute optimizer data into one central location. So if you are working in your FinOps team, or you can CCOE looking to optimize across the board, you can use this lab to pull all of your compute optimizer data into one location and find those Lambdas that are spending too much money. The other thing is that Lambda is now available with Graviton too. So Graviton is an AMD chip rather than an Intel, and it is a 20% lower cost and a 39% better price performance. So there's a great, if you Google just Lambda Graviton, there's some new information about how to use it. And because it's all managed under the hood, you shouldn't see a change with your Lambda functions, but really recommend going there and checking out, especially if you were a serverless kind of heavy customer. So my summary of Lambda, check out if you're over provision, the same way you would with your RDS or your EC2 instances. See if you actually need all that storage. Review utilization and resize as needed. Bring this into the conversation when you're thinking about resizing your compute, because there is a saving to be made. And definitely check out the Compute Optimizer Lambda section if you don't go in there, and see the Lambda Graviton blog as a really good way to kind of get starting. But speaking of compute, let's move into EC2 Other. So we have two services from EC2 Other that I'm going to focus on. And the first is EBS Snapshots. So I'm not going to talk about EBS because, again, this is quite a common service in which we see customers optimizing, whether they have idle ones, which you could see in Trusted Advisor, or you have provisioned too much storage, again, like we talked about Lambda. And so these are kind of common ways in which you can save money on them. But not everybody looks at snapshot costs. So snapshots are incremental backups, which mean they are only the blocks that have changed on the device are the ones that are going to be snapshotted and saved and charged. So we often see, again, that customers have a way of solving to make sure that they optimize their spend in snapshots by using lifecycle policies. So they make sure that if they have an application that's snapshotting regularly, they will have a lifecycle policy to remove old snapshots that they don't need anymore. That's great. That's the normal thing to do. But there are three cases in which people kind of miss some snapshots that they could save money on. And the first two are about AMIs. So AMIs are images of EC2. And when you take an image of an EC2, you create a snapshot that goes along with it. Now, if you release that AMI, you get rid of it, that snapshot is now useless. You can't do anything with it, but you're still paying for it. So you can go into your account, look at your description of your snapshot, you can see it there. Or if you use that module that I talked about, that lab, the well-architected lab, there is a module that will help you find this out there. So just a clue if you really want to have a look at this. But the long and the short, if you have a lot of AMIs being created and then deleted, and you're not deleting your snapshots, there is a risk of spending too much money. The other thing is that AMIs are not being used. So I remember back when I was a customer and we would be creating images using something like Packer or another kind of image tool. And we will be constantly trying to improving, testing the scripts out with the user data, making images constantly. But we weren't necessarily the best at deleting the ones that we weren't really using, or at least I remember back in the day that I wasn't necessarily. So I'll hold my hands up to that. But it meant looking back that there were probably loads of snapshots that were made in conjunction to those AMIs. and the AMI still existed but were never used. So if you are in a development process where you're working on your images, make sure you are getting rid of your old ones. And the last one is a kind of classic one, which is where people take manual snapshots. So they take a whole snapshot of the volume, not this incremental type. They take it the full time and they're paying for the full storage each time. This often happens if you are doing a backup. So say you're doing an upgrade of something like Jira or another application that you're using in the cloud. Someone will be like, I'll take a manual backup just in case. That's a great, don't not do that, but take a manual backup and then they're like, oh, okay, the upgrade goes well, and they leave that manual backup to just keep costing money and the full amount of that storage each time. And that can, again, over time cost money. And sometimes if you look back, especially in things like the shared services accounts we had, there were these snapshots that would have been around for years and no one would ever want them again, because after a few days, something like Jira's changed. All the tickets have changed, little things inside of it have changed. That snapshot is useless now. So take a look at your snapshot views, use the cur, see what you're using, and see if you could find ways to optimize. So look out for those one-off snapshots and also the ones where AMIs are removed. Do look at data lifecycle management for these things specifically and see if you can go through and delete the old ones. And again, check out the module on the Well-Architected Labs. There's a query in there that will enable you to grab all of your AMIs and all of your snapshots, put them together, and you can see where that gap is, where the AMIs have gone, but your snapshots still exist. So on to my last service. And this is one of my favorite ones to talk about. If anybody saw me talk back in the day, probably the first meetup, I probably mentioned Elastic IPs then, and I always still bring them up now. And so Elastic IPs are reserved public IP addresses that you can assign to an EC2. And they cost 0.005 cents an hour when they're not attached to a live EC2. So 0.005 cents an hour, it's not that much, and it won't break the bank. But if there are a lot of Elastic IPs that kind of culminate over time and you're spending them, that's an hour, you think about a day, a month is $3.36, a year is 12 times that this money does add up. And you can see this is a real customer screenshot I took where they had so many IPs that it cost them $2,700 in a year. Again, if you are a multi-million-dollar spending kind of customer, that's not that much, but it's a waste of money, so you might as well get rid of it if you're not using them. And the bigger problem is if there's something that's causing Elastic IP addresses to be constantly idle, what are you using that? What's going on there? Or have you got so many stopped instances that have an Elastic IP attached to them? Well, even if the EC2 instance is stopped, you're still paying for that volume. So sometimes this may not be the main problem, but it enables you to find out what else is going on in your accounts. So it's just occurred to me that says snapshot takeaways when it should be Elastic IP takeaways, so I apologize. Elastic IPs become attached from EC2 instances and they incur costs. Again, it's that compound cost that we are looking at. So the key thing is to make sure you review and release any Elastic IP addresses you are not needed. I recommend using things like Trusted Advisor to help you find these, or just look in Cost Explorer and actually filter by Elastic IP. So bring that background to your view of Cost Explorer and see what's going on. So thanks. Hopefully I wanted to, I kind of compressed that presentation a bit. So hopefully that was okay and I didn't talk too fast. Thank you for listening. Before we finish and before we have some questions, I wanted to shout out 3 things from us. So I host a Twitch show every week called the Keys to AWS Optimizations on Thursdays. It will now be 3:30 BT, so GMT. And if you liked hearing me chat about this kind of stuff, there's me and 2 of my co-hosts where we talk about different things, different ways to optimize in the cloud. Today we recorded a session on sustainability and how that relates to cost optimization, which was really interesting. So really recommend checking that out. There is also the AWS Cloud Financial Management Peer Group. So there are 2 events coming up this year. They are a place in which we have customers come and tell their stories and then break out into smaller groups and share what's going on, share that knowledge. So it's driven by customers rather than kind of Amazon talking. And lastly, reInvent's coming up, exciting times. Unfortunately, I'm not going this year, but if you're able to kind of log into any of these sessions, these are the ones that we recommend to watch either virtually or in person. So hopefully you enjoyed that and maybe you've learned something, and hopefully some of you will go away and start looking into ways to optimize those other services. But does anybody have any questions? And I've just realized I've been off camera that whole time and I meant to be on camera, so that's embarrassing.
Steph, that was a really great talk. So over the years, been burnt by many of those. So it's great to have this information up front for anyone who's starting out. I've got a question on Lambdas. So very cost-effective pricing. So when you look at the pricing sheet, it's fractions of a dollar for 1 million invocations, and even smaller fractions of a penny for the memory and CPU. But it's not a silver bullet, so it's not suited for all scenarios. Have you seen any customers where they switched to Lambda and then ended up overspending?
I've I have a great story where we had a guy who, and this was when I was at KPMG, so unfortunately it's not an Amazon customer, but there was a team and they'd made a Lambda function that they didn't realize was triggered by another Lambda function, which then triggered that Lambda function. So it was this constant cycle of Lambda function, trigger Lambda function. And one day they looked at the bill and they'd spent like X amount of thousands of dollars on Lambda. And everyone was like, why are we spending so much on Lambda? And it turned out they had this cycle going on. And it was just like, all they had to do was go and say, like, let's delete this invocation section. And then they stopped wasting the money. So yeah, like you said, it's not a one bullet kind of solve problem. I'd recommend if you're using it, just kind of keep an eye on the costs. They will often be the lower down of that section, but maybe use things like AWS budgets or anomaly detection to highlight things like Lambda is a good way of keeping track of what's going on those costs.
Great, cool. We've got a question coming on the text. So how often are AWS workspaces an overspending area? So that's come from Charles Roberts.
So I haven't seen, I haven't seen many workspaces recently. I know that we did used to run similar to instance scheduler, we used to turn them off using a Python script, or there was a way to do like auto stop that we would turn them off, but that was the big way we saw in which people were optimizing them. But it hasn't come up as a massive thing in areas of optimization recently that I've seen. It might be that my customers aren't really used to it, but I might go and dive into that as a new area of optimization. Thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, thanks for the answer.
Anybody else?
I might actually piggyback on that. One of the other things I would call out for workspaces is that's one area that doesn't always get called out for right sizing. And, it is very much just as applicable as EC2 for right sizing. So I would recommend that even if you don't have tooling necessarily like Datadog, New Relic, or anything like that to track on that, find a way to pull back those metrics, which I believe I believe that CloudWatch actually does pull those back through. So you should be able to tie into that, still be able to see where you're under provisioned, and then pull that back across. Now, with workspaces, you're usually talking about end users. You're not talking about engineers that are using these things. And so in those cases, it may make sense to have somebody who's sort of elected to keep an eye, monitor over those, and be the one to drive those right sizing opportunities for workspaces, and then just make sure they're communicating with the end user as well.
Yeah, definitely. Anything where you have to define a size, you can probably save money by make sure you're defining the right size. It's a good call.
Great. Any more questions? Feel free to pop in the questions into the chat if you think of anything afterwards. I know Steph's got to drop off early, but we'll try and get her to answer then any of them. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Steph.
Me, guys.
Okay, next, so leading on from, getting those recommendations about, where you can save, we're going to talk about how to actually get those savings. So engaging engineers to actually take action. So we're over to Mike Bradbury, who's in the sunny beach of Macclesfield, to talk about how to engage engineers and getting them to take action on FinOps.
Oh, thanks, Bubs. And thank you for inviting me to talk at the meetup. I haven't spoken in front of a meetup before, so neither have I done this presentation before. So I'm something of a newbie here. So I'm hoping you guys will be a bit gentle with me. Let me see if I can share my screen here and get this working okay. Okay, how's that?
That's all coming in through good, thanks.
Cool. So I don't have a technical background in FinOps, but I was one of the guys who was charged with analyzing the data that came back from the State of FinOps survey. And so I was one of the few guys who put together the analysis on which the subsequent report was based. And this presentation comes out of that work, and it's about how to engage with engineers to get them excited about FinOps. So whatever your cloud vision is, or your cloud goal is, or your cloud strategy is, engineers are going to be on your front line. Recruiting them, developing them, retaining them, getting the best out of them is the key challenge for all organizations moving to the cloud, because when engineers are energized, empowered, and excited, there's virtually no limit to what you can do with cloud. But if without those guys, you're going nowhere. So it's very important to look at how we best engage with engineers and how we can get the best out of them. And that's what this presentation is all about. So the State of FinOps survey highlighted that almost 40% of the respondents felt getting engineers to take action was an unsolved pain point, a big unsolved pain point or challenge for them. And it's important here to make a note that we're not saying engineers are the problem here. We're not pointing to engineers as the bad guys here. In fact, there are no bad guys. We're not so much saying that engineers aren't willing or interested in taking action on FinOps recommendations. We're more saying that perhaps the problem that users are getting in translating FinOps recommendations into action is the context, the organizational context in which engineers are working, with sometimes conflicting priorities, sometimes huge workloads being pulled in different directions and so on. So we're not going to focus, or I'm not going to focus too much on engineers in this presentation. I'm going to talk about the organizational context in which they're working. And with that in mind, when we looked at the data from the survey, we asked ourselves, well, what are the actions that we want engineers to take that they're not taking? And we grouped them into 4 sets of questions, or 4 sets of actions. First of all, we wanted engineers to label resources so we knew who owned them. Next up, we wanted to design and build cost-efficient solutions. Above that, we wanted them to own and manage their usage and costs. And last, we wanted them to collaborate in business decision-making. So we saw those 4 actions, or 4 groups of action, as a pathway from engineering to achieve the organization's cloud value vision and goals. And there was a rough correlation in that pathway with the familiar FinOps maturity model, crawl, walk, run. Because you couldn't even begin to crawl without sensible cost allocation, usage allocation, and ownership. And you may not be equipped to get full collaboration on business decision making until you got to the run stage. So that was the context within which we saw the issue of getting engineers to take action. And there was a follow-up question in the survey that said, okay, so what strategies and tactics are you using to get developers or engineers to engage in cloud cost management? And here there was, I suppose, a driving force, a unifying factor that pulled most of the comments together that we analyzed, and that was the concept of ownership. It was pretty clear that if there is a key concept in getting engineers engaged with FinOps and excited about FinOps, it was getting them to have ownership of cloud usage and cost, to feel that ownership, to feel empowered by that ownership. Okay, so great. So how do you encourage that ownership? What tactics can you use to drive ownership and empowerment? And I've just listed the key 4 ones here because there's a sort of thread between these. Clearly, education and training is a key point, because until engineers understand what's expected of them, understand what's possible, understand what the organization is trying to do, And until FinOps practitioners understand how to work with engineers and how to get results with engineers, nothing's going to work too well. And indeed, as many of you will know, the foundation runs training programs across the board for engineers, FinOps practitioners, and coming down the pipe are programs for executives and finance and product owners and so on. So education and training was mentioned by 173 of the responses. Just behind that was the provision of relevant and timely information. Okay, so step one, you educate the engineers and the FinOps practitioners and all the people they work with. Step two, you give everybody the information they need in order to feel that they can do something about it. Step three, 55 people mentioned having given them the information, you can then challenge engineers to solve the problem for you. How do you optimize this stuff? Here's the information, you know what we expect, please solve it for us. And many of the comments focused on the idea that telling engineers you've got a solution is a rather less effective approach than telling engineers you have a problem, giving them the information and inviting them to solve it for you. Probably create a better solution as well. Finally, everyone wants to feel important. We all want to feel important. Engineers are like no one else. Recognition and celebration of success is a key factor. So 101 comments in the survey related to creating situations where you can recognize engineering performance, celebrate the success. And these might be part of gamification initiatives, or they might simply be a pat on the back from an engineering lead or a senior executive. Either way, recognizing that engineers are delivering something valuable for the organization is another way of promoting a sense of ownership and empowerment. So if ownership empowers and excites engineers, what is the organizational context within which we can encourage that excitement and get something out of it? So this is a little complex, this diagram, well, it is for me anyway, but it shows the same sort of pathway from bottom to top of the engineering teams working towards the organization's cloud value, vision, and goals. At the baseline, we have ownership. To reinforce ownership, we need usage and cost allocation. And to do that, we need account hierarchy and metadata. So that is the foundation level. How do we go above that and build a context that drives ownership and encourages engineers to be engaged and excited? Step one, we drive engineering accountability by education, providing information, and techniques such as showback. And what we're talking about here is engineers using their own sense of professional pride to develop efficient solutions because that's what they want to do as professional engineers. So it's nothing to do with finance or other stuff outside of engineering. It's more a sense of, I'm a professional engineer. Now I know that cost is important. Now I can see what usage and costs relate to what I'm doing. I want to make this more efficient. And there were 259 comments in the survey that were variations of that story. Originally, we called this self-accountability because really it was an engineer looking at himself and saying, I want to do something better. I want to do something more efficient. But I think it makes more sense to call it engineering accountability because it's an engineer feeling that it's part of his professional discipline to design efficient software. Next step up, we got financial accountability because engineers, like everyone else in the organization that spends money, is accountable to finance. And so we have chargeback budgets, maybe shameback. I don't want to talk too much about shameback, but the idea here is that we're reinforcing ownership by encouraging financial accountability. It's not a sense of imposing a burden on engineers, so much as to say, you are financially accountable. You have your own sort of profit and loss account for the cloud resources you own. What value are those cloud resources delivering? What are the costs of them? You're accountable for that. So 70 responses were variations of setting up chargeback, forecast, budgets, enforcing financial accountability, driving the ownership of engineers, the responsibility for financial accountability. And the next level up was business accountability. So here we were talking about working with finance, working with product owners, identifying the best iron triangle solutions for time, quality, and cost. So collaboration, metrics, maybe KPIs, scorecards related to where the organization wants to go, maybe some gamification initiatives. There were 110 responses that were variations of that, connecting engineers with the business direction, with the organization's overarching goals. So if we take what I said earlier about not wanting to focus on the engineers themselves, but more on the organizational context in which they work, this is that organizational context with ownership, a sense of ownership underpinning everything, with engineering accountability, financial accountability, business accountability overlaid on top of that ownership and reinforcing it. We have an organizational concept that supports the idea of ownership and the empowerment of engineers and gives them scope to do wonderful things with cloud. Of course, you're not going to jump from wherever you are today to excited, energized, empowered engineers who are doing all the FinOps stuff for you. It's going to be a step-by-step approach. And I guess most of the people on the call will be familiar with the FinOps life cycle, or FinOps phases, as I think we're now supposed to call them. Inform, optimize, operate. An iterative process where we go around the cycle and then iterate again and again and again and progressively move towards our goal. And this idea of getting engineers to own cloud and be empowered and excited about what they can do with FinOps is necessarily a step-by-step process. But I'd like to propose a development to this standard life cycle. In this regard, I'm indebted to my great friend, Mr. Ben Demora, who is actually on this call today. Ben and I were talking a couple of months ago about something related to this, and he came up with the idea that, you know what, inform, optimize, and operate is certainly right, it's certainly necessary, but is it sufficient to lift everything up to where we want it to go? And so I'm going to propose here the elevated FinOps life cycle, which includes this stage of inspire and elevate. Okay, you inform, you optimize, you operate, and then take a little time to see where you've come, to see what you've achieved, to recognize your successes, to inspire and elevate yourself before you go around the cycle again. I think that's a great concept, and I'm going to propose to JR that we add another stage to that, another phase to those phases. So in summary, I've talked about how to get engineers excited about FinOps. I think what comes out of the State of FinOps survey is that ownership empowers engineers. If you build an organizational context that reinforces ownership, you're well on the way. Empowered, excited engineers working in the right context will honestly solve most of your cloud value problems for you. Without those guys, you're going nowhere. And if you can inspire and elevate them to achieve the organization's cloud vision and goals, well, you've made it. Thank you. If you want any more information about any of that stuff, the State of FinOps survey, the engineering action playbook, and the organizational context that I've talked about, or the FinOps Foundation training programs, they're all there on the foundation website. If you want any more information from me, you can get me at mike@finopsaccelerator.com. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. We now open up the floor to any questions that people may have. I suppose my first question is to Ben. Are you ready to teach another 2 hours in the practitioner course for the additional phase?
Yeah, man, bring it on. Let's do it. Definitely. Now, whenever I'm teaching that practitioner course, I generally tend to kind of go on a little bit about motivating the different personas, right? Because it's one thing to provide the mechanism, it's one thing to provide the insights and provide all the framework, but unless you actually get somebody excited about it, unless you show them how it directly relates to their world and how they can be in charge of making their situation better by using this information, you kind of miss a step. You don't join the chain up. So yeah, I'm on for that. Let's do it. Maybe add some more breaks in the course if we do that, though. More coffee, man.
I've got a question here. So in terms of engaging engineers, gamification is one of the ways. How have you seen the uptake of gamification?
Well, it's quite an interesting issue, gamification. Am I muted or am I on?
No, we can hear you. Yep.
Because a lot of people get very excited about gamification, but if you ask around who's actually doing it, there aren't too many people who will say we're actually doing anything sensible. And as you pointed out, Bubs, in our chat yesterday, a gamification initiative probably works once, maybe it can work twice, but it's not something you can just repeat without everybody getting a bit fed up with it. So I think the idea of gamification is good. Certainly, maybe 8 to 10% of the responses in the survey said they were doing gamification, in the sense they were trying to structure activities that engineers would see as some sort of competition. But I think the jury's still out on how, where it fits into a FinOps strategy. I guess in some organizations, it would fit with the culture and it's probably a good thing to do. Perhaps in other cultures, it would be seen as a bit of a gimmick. But I think it's a great thing to consider. If any way you can engage engineers and point them towards a common goal, hackathons, I think, are a great idea. Get teams coming together to try new things, invent new ways of doing things. That's a fabulous idea. And if you see that as a subsection within gamification, I think that's a great idea. Gamification has definitely got a future, but I don't think many people have worked out yet how best to use it.
I think to Mike's point as well about making it interesting and exciting. Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those problems that isn't a one and done. If you want to start doing some level of competition or some level of leaderboard or whatever, it needs to not just become another part of BAU. If you want to make it exciting and engaging, it needs to be continually evolved and created on. So yeah, I mean, I've seen it work very, very rarely. And only when I've seen it work, it's only been when people have been putting a lot of effort into making it fun and making it different every time.
Cool. Thanks for your inputs. Yeah, the next state of FinOps surveys are about to go out to everyone as well. So it'll be interesting to see whether getting engineers, to take action is still going to be one of the problem points that people see. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, so if anyone's got any questions, feel free to shout them out. Okay, in the meantime, I'll do the wrap up for today. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, taking out time from your evening or your morning, depending on which part of the world you're on. Thanks to Steph and Mike for the presentations. We're planning the next meetup towards the end of January, so give you time to get over all the festive period, and you'll be looking forward to getting back into FinOps. We're not sure yet whether that's going to be an in-person or a virtual, but we'll keep posted on the meetup group. We also hope to have Siwa. So Siwa from AstraZeneca was due to be our third speaker today, but due to the date change, he wasn't able to come today. So we're hoping to get him in on one of the next events. And also call for people who want to present anything. Please get in touch with either myself or Mark via the FinOps Slack or on the Meetup group, and we're happy to hear proposals from you. Okay, and once we have the recording links available, we'll post them into the Meetup group as well, and you'll probably see it on the FinOps Foundation Slack. Okay, if anyone hasn't got anything else, then thank you all for joining. Have a good evening. Have a good day, rest of the day.
Cheers, Burps. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thanks.